The old block of apple trees sat on the back slope of the Sayre place outside Lovingston, Virginia. 20-some trees nobody in 3 generations had bothered naming, beyond calling them the Spitters. On account of what happened in a person's mouth the one time they made the mistake of biting into the fruit straight off the branch. The bark on the oldest trunks had gone gray and gnarled enough that a stranger driving past might have mistaken the whole block for something already dead. Every buyer who ever looked at that fruit for 10 years running saw the same thing: small, lumpy, russeted apples too bitter for sauce and too sour for a pie. The kind of crop a Cannery wouldn't touch at any price worth a man's trouble to pick it. They were all looking at the same flaw, and every one of them was wrong about what that flaw actually meant. Most people watching a story like this scroll past without ever subscribing. This is the kind of story my father would tell, and his father before him. The kind that takes a few generations to finally pay off instead of a single season. The kind that rewards a man for keeping something nobody else thought was worth the ground it stood on. If yours told stories like that too, this channel is for you. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling them. Nelson County sits in the foothills of Virginia's Blue Ridge, apple country going back well over a century, the slopes terraced with orchard rows that turn the hillsides white every April and red every September. Roadside stands sold cider and fried pies along Route 29 every fall. The kind of small commerce that had kept half the county's family orchards afloat through decades when the bigger packing houses up north could undercut them on price for everything else. Emmett Sayre's family had farmed the same 140 acres outside Lovingston since his great-grandfather cleared the first block in the 1890s, growing the standard eating varieties, Stamen, York, Winesap, that made up the bulk of what Blue Ridge apple products, the cannery 3 miles down the valley, bought up every fall for sauce and pie filling. A contract that had kept 3 generations of Sayers in business through droughts, hailstorms, and at least 2 stretches of low apple prices nobody in the family liked to talk about much. Tucked behind the main orchard, on a steep northeast slope nobody had ever bothered grading for modern equipment, sat the older block Emmett's grandfather Asa had planted sometime before the First World War. A mixed stand of varieties nobody in the family had kept careful records on, grown originally for one purpose only: hard cider, the way Virginia farms had made it for 200 years before Prohibition mostly killed the practice, and most families never fully revived it. Blue Ridge Apple Products bought Emmett's standard varieties every fall on a straightforward contract. The same arrangement his father had kept for decades before him, but the cannery's buyer had never once taken fruit off that old back block. Not in the 10 years Emmett had been the one hauling crates down to the scale himself. The Spitters ran too small and too irregular in shape for the cannery's automated peeling and coring line, calibrated tight enough that an apple outside a narrow size window jammed the machinery more often than it processed cleanly. Worse than the size, by the cannery's own accounting, was the taste. A standard eating apple carried enough sugar and little enough tannin that a child could eat one straight off the tree without flinching. The Spitters carried tannin levels closer to a strong cup of black tea than any apple a modern grocery shopper would recognize, an astringent, mouth-puckering bitterness that made for a genuinely unpleasant bite raw, and an even worse batch of sauce, since boiling concentrated the bitterness rather than softening it. Carl Sheffey, who'd bought fruit for Blue Ridge for going on 15 years, turned Emmett away from that block every single autumn, with some version of the same explanation, standing at the same scale house window each time, with the same patient, apologetic shake of his head. "Can't run something through my line that jams the core and tastes like a mouthful of bark besides," he told him most years, not unkindly. The same conversation repeated so many times it had become almost a ritual between them. The kind of exchange 2 men have grown comfortable enough with that neither bothers dressing it up anymore. What Carl Sheffey had no particular reason to know, because a cannery buyer's whole job revolved around sauce and pie filling rather than fermented cider, was that the very qualities making the spitters worthless on his production line were exactly the qualities a serious cider maker spent a career hunting for. High tannin in a cider apple did for fermented cider roughly what tannin does for a serious red wine. It gave the finished product structure, complexity, and a long dry finish that sweet-eating apples, pressed and fermented on their own, could never produce no matter how skilled the cider maker. Most commercial eating apples made a thin, one-dimensional cider when fermented alone. Sweet going in, and sweet coming out with little else to say for itself. Which was why serious cider makers had always blended in a portion of high tannin fruit the way a winemaker blends in a structural grape variety. The English and French cider traditions that Virginia's earliest settlers had carried across the Atlantic relied almost entirely on varieties exactly like the ones growing wild and half forgotten on Asa Sire's old back slope. Apples bred over centuries specifically to be inedible fresh and exceptional fermented. A category cider makers still called bitter sharps and bitter sweets depending on the balance of tannin to acid. Modern commercial orchards, chasing the eating and sauce markets that paid steady money, had mostly abandoned those old varieties generations before Emmett was born. Grafting over old cider blocks with standard eating varieties across most of the state by the middle of the 20th century, which meant a genuine, mature stand of them, still producing after more than a century, had become considerably rarer than anybody driving past that overgrown slope would ever have guessed. Asa Sari had planted that block sometime around 1916, grafting cuttings he'd gotten from an older neighbor whose own family had kept cider apples since before the Civil War. A connection to the old varieties that ran back further than anybody in the county could fully document anymore. He'd pressed cider from that block every October for the rest of his life, more out of habit and pleasure than necessity, long after Prohibition made the practice technically illegal, and long after most of his neighbors had let their own cider blocks go to pasture, rather than bother with a crop that no longer had any legal market. Asa never once seemed troubled by that particular inconvenience. He kept a small wooden press in the same barn where he kept his other equipment, used it every fall with whichever of his grandchildren happened to be around to help turn the screw, and never once, as far as anyone in the family could remember, explained in any detail why those particular trees mattered enough to keep when the cannery contract for the standard varieties paid considerably better, for considerably less work. Emmett had spent a dozen Octobers as a boy turning that same press screw beside his grandfather, the smell of crushed apples and the particular ache in his forearms by the end of an afternoon's pressing among his clearest memories of the man. Asa would stand at the press in his canvas coat, checking the pomace with 2 fingers the same unhurried way he checked most things, smelling it once before nodding to himself, and tell Emmett, on the rare afternoons he said much of anything at all, that a man who only grew what sold easy never learned what a piece of ground was actually capable of. He died in 1987, the autumn Emmett turned 16, sitting in the same kitchen chair he'd sat in every evening of Emmett's whole childhood, without ever once calling what he was doing with that old block anything more romantic than making cider the way his own father had taught him to make it. The funeral fell 2 weeks before that year's harvest, and Emmett remembers pressing the spitters alone for the first time that October, turning the screw by himself in a barn that felt considerably emptier than it had the autumn before, not entirely sure, at 16, whether he was keeping a promise or just unable to let the one thing his grandfather had cared most about simply stop. Emmett kept the block alive after that mostly out of the same stubborn sentiment, pressing a few barrels every fall for the family's own table, hauling the rest to Blue Ridge each October out of habit more than hope, and getting turned away each time the same patient way his grandfather, by Emmett's own recollection, had never once seemed bothered by being turned away either, since Asa had never once tried selling the fruit to a cannery in the first place. What changed 10 years into that same ritual was a phone call from a cider maker named Dorothy Lanham, who ran a small, well-regarded cidery 40 minutes south and had been quietly asking around the county that fall about anybody still growing old, bitter-sharp varieties on the kind of scale worth a serious look. A mutual acquaintance at the county extension office had mentioned the Sayre place almost as an afterthought, the kind of detail that gets passed along in casual conversation without anybody involved expecting much to come of it. Dorothy called first, introduced herself, and asked if she could come walk the block before committing to driving 40 minutes on what might turn out to be nothing. Emmett told her to come whenever suited her. She drove out the following week, walked the old block with Emmett, and spent most of an hour tasting fruit off half a dozen different trees with the kind of careful, deliberate attention a sommelier gives a flight of wine, spitting each bite into the grass the way the trees themselves had always been named for. She'd brought a small notebook of her own, jotting brief notes after each tree, occasionally asking Emmett to confirm which limb a particular apple had come from. "This one," she said, standing under a tree near the bottom of the slope, holding up a small russeted apple with a skin the color of an old penny. "Do you know what this is?" Emmett told her he didn't, not by name, only that his grandfather had always called the whole block the Spitters and left it at that. Dorothy turned the apple over once in her hand before answering. "I think it might be a variety we lost track of 70 years ago," she said. "I'd need to send a sample off to confirm it, but I haven't tasted anything like it outside 2 or 3 orchards in the entire state." She told him, by the third tree, that she'd pay considerably more per bushel for it than Blue Ridge Apple Products had ever paid him for his standard crop, assuming he was willing to sell it fresh pressed rather than as whole fruit. Emmett didn't have a press large enough to handle a serious commercial volume, not at first, and spent that winter and the following spring researching equipment, talking to 2 other small growers in the county who'd gone through similar transitions, and finally investing in a proper rack and cloth press capable of running several tons a day instead of the few barrels his grandfather's old screw press had ever managed in an afternoon. The new press cost more than Emmett had spent on equipment in any single year since taking over the place, a number that made his wife raise an eyebrow at the kitchen table before she finally told him to go ahead and order it, having watched him turn that screw press by hand for 10 autumns running without once complaining about it. Dorothy Lanham bought his entire first commercial harvest that fall, paying him roughly 4 times what Blue Ridge would have paid for the same tonnage of standard apples, and told 2 other regional cideries about the Sayre block before the season was out. The kind of word of mouth that moves fast in a craft industry small enough that everybody serious about it tends to know everybody else. Within 3 years, Emmett was pressing and shipping juice to cideries and home fermenters across 16 states. The old back block expanded with new grafts taken from the original trees, plus 2 additional acres planted in classic English bitter-sharp varieties he'd sourced through a specialty nursery, once he understood exactly what he was working with. He hired a part-time hand for the first time that third autumn, a young man named Travis Quinn who'd grown up 2 farms over and took to the pressing operation with an enthusiasm Emmett still finds a little surprising in anybody under 30. The math, run out loud at his own kitchen table the way his father and grandfather had both run their own numbers before him, came to something close to 11 times the per-acre return of his standard eating varieties, a comparison Emmett still finds himself making out loud to skeptical neighbors more often than he probably needs to, usually standing at the same back slope fence line where Asa once stood with his own 2 fingers checking pomace. Carl Sheffey still buys Emmett's standard crop every fall, the same straightforward contract as always, and the 2 men still talk easily enough when Emmett hauls a load down to the Cannery scale. Carl told him, a couple of years into the cider business, that he'd never once doubted his own judgment about that back block. Not exactly, since nothing about those apples had ever been a fit for his own production line. Wasn't wrong about the jam up on the core, he said, leaning against the scale house the same way he had for years. Just never thought to wonder what else somebody might want it for. What he hadn't considered, he admitted, standing at the same scale where he'd turned Emmett away 10 autumns running, was that being wrong for one buyer's line didn't mean being wrong for everybody's. He asked Emmett, mostly out of curiosity, whether he'd ever consider selling the Cannery a small batch for some kind of specialty product of their own. Emmett told him he'd think about it. The same non-committal answer he gave most things he hadn't fully decided on yet. Emmett still presses a few barrels every October, purely for the family. The same wooden screw press his grandfather used, standing in the same corner of the same barn, brought out once a year more out of ceremony than necessity now that the commercial press handles everything else. His own children take turns on the screw, the way he once did beside Asa. The youngest still small enough that her whole body weight barely moves it, and Emmett has started telling them, the same unhurried way his grandfather once told him things, that a piece of ground is usually capable of more than whatever the easiest buyer that year happens to want from it. He still can't explain, any better than Asa ever could, exactly why those particular trees mattered enough to keep alive through 10 lean years of being turned away. He just knows his grandfather kept them anyway, season after season, without ever once needing a buyer to tell him they were worth the trouble, and that some inheritances don't show their full value until the person who left them behind has been gone longer than anybody expects.